Hallo Hamburg, hallo Deutschland. My name is Julia Sneeringer, and I'm a professor of history at the City University of New York. I've published work on the social history of early rock and roll in Hamburg, and I also have a short history of West Germany coming out with Bloomsbury Academic Press next month. More relevant to this particular forum is my book, Winning Women's Votes, on political propaganda for women voters during the Weimar Republic. So Torsten and his team have asked me to offer my take on the upcoming elections here in the US, not least because I happen to live in the swing state of Pennsylvania. So first off, I just want to say that as a person living in Pennsylvania, we are all quite exhausted with this election. Here in Philadelphia, my physical mailbox, and I won't even talk about my email, is stuffed with campaign materials every single day. My husband has a Hispanic name, which I think just doubles the flood of material that we're getting. Most of this material has been from the Democrats. I mean, I am, a registered Democrat, and a lot of it is also coming from labor unions. I'm a member of the teachers union. But interestingly, last month there was this weird wave of Trump propaganda coming into our mailboxes, packed with the most simplistic and misleading information that you can imagine. And we were getting this Trump material even though we are registered Democrats in a very solidly blue district. And this kind of had the feeling of a campaign that was just burning through money, throwing anything at the wall to see if they could peel off the odd voter here and there. And I suspect, too, it might have had something to do with the fact that my 23-year-old son lives with us, and the young male demographic has been heavily courted by the Trumpists this year. So at any rate, this exhaustion factor, the Wahlmüdigkeit, is very real here. Many people have already begun to vote by mail. I suspect that the vast majority of people have already made up their minds and are no longer persuadable. So now it's really a game of turnout on both sides. There's a strong feeling of sort of the absurdity of the content of this election, particularly for the majority of Americans who do not support Trump. And yes, we are the majority. It's only the ridiculous Electoral College that makes this election even somewhat close. But so many people can't really believe that we're here again, even when Trump is such a patently unqualified, awful, criminal, disgrace to the office of the presidency, you name it. And, the major news outlets in this country, I think, deserve some of the blame for this sense of a sort of continuation of the same old story. There's a strong sense in which a lot of them did not learn their lessons from the 2016 election with the sort of soft coverage of Trump and the much harsher interrogation of the Democratic candidates. Maybe you've heard the term sane washing. This is when influential papers like the New York Times or the Washington Post take Trump's incoherent, bizarre pronouncements at his rallies or his speaking events, and they put them into sort of rational sounding summaries. And what this does is it makes Trump sound rational or normal. It also has the effect of normalizing his extremist and often very hateful ideas. One journalist, Parker Malloy, described sane washing as a major source of information that poses a threat to democracy because it ends up downplaying Trump's radical agenda. And the effects of this normalization can be seen in polls that show that a very sizable majority of Americans don't like Trump. They don't think he's a good leader. They don't think he's a good guy, but they're still willing to vote for him because they think he's better on the economy or border security. So one person joked on social media that it's like we have a choice between puppies for everyone or diarrhea forever. And a lot of people can't make up their mind about that particular choice. So when I did this forum back in November of 2020, I called that election a referendum on Trump, and I still think that that's true. And this is certainly the case that Harris has been pressing, especially lately with her slogan, "We won't go back." So for me, one of the key aspects of this election is the battle between memory versus forgetting. The Biden-Harris administration has been one of the best on record for workers' rights, job creation, the transition to a green economy, whittling down student debt. And yet there's this stubborn pessimism about the economy, mainly due to high prices. And Trump and the Republican candidates for House and Senate have all been just relentless on this issue. It's inflation, inflation, inflation. But the root cause of that inflation, the COVID pandemic, has been completely flushed down the memory hole. The GOP is even running on that old line, "Are you better off than you were 4 years ago?" Counting on the fact that most Americans have completely forgotten what 2020 was actually like. So the memory of the pandemic has really been buried. And Harris has been kind of hitting back on that recently, as have Barack Obama and Joe Biden in some of their speeches. So that makes the historian in me happy. The historian in me is also struck by how COVID is still the great unprocessed trauma. The hundreds of thousands of preventable deaths that were caused by Trump's inaction and outright misinformation seem to matter very little to certainly the people that support him, but even I think most Americans really seem to have forgotten so much of it. And Trump is still selling quack, medical cures like ivermectin, along with his NFT trading cards and the other junk that he sells. And speaking of junk, I think there's a strong element of fan culture among Trump's base. His hardcore supporters know all of his greatest hits, and they flock to his rallies kind of like Grateful Dead fans. These are communal gatherings of the faithful where they share vibes and they sell their Trump merchandise. And speaking from a sort of totally non-scientific perspective, I've been seeing less of that this year. Certainly the hardcore fans are still there, but they feel less visible. And it also feels less visible when you drive around, out in the countryside. You don't see nearly as many Trump signs as you used to see. So Trump certainly still has his fan base, but I don't think that cult is growing. And it's interesting to watch the Harris-Walz campaign try and sort of match Trump on the merchandise front. There's a lot of homemade Harris merchandise out there as well, and it's very highly visible in my blue corner of Pennsylvania. So I'm very interested in the sort of material culture, the fan culture of the election, and how that's playing out. Obviously, another key theme this year is gender. Unlike Hillary Clinton, Harris is kind of downplaying the whole first woman president angle and is instead laser focused on reproductive rights as a basic issue of freedom. And she's very clearly trying to co-opt the language of freedom that Republicans have monopolized since Ronald Reagan. Abortion is absolutely a major reason why the Republicans lost the midterm elections in 2022. And despite a certain persistence of the white female Trump vote, I think that women are Harris's ultimate weapon. Women across lines of class and race are aggrieved over reproductive rights, plain and simple. The contempt for women that oozes from J.D. Vance in particular has also, been quite difficult to overlook. He's got a very clear natalist agenda, and he is incredibly unpopular across the board, interestingly, certainly among Democrats, but also among a lot of Republicans as well. So the J.D. Vance factor is something that will be interesting to see how it plays out. But back to the issue of gender, young women are visibly energized, and that's even setting aside the sort of Taylor Swift factor, which actually resulted in a surge in voter registrations among young people. And young queer people are also very energized by the Harris-Walz ticket. Harris and Walz have won their admiration for standing up for things like trans rights, for example, in the face of some really outlandish attack ads on that issue. Trump and the GOP, in contrast, are betting heavily on young men, trying to speak to their anxieties about their own position economically and socially, their defensiveness as they see young women getting ahead. Despite this being the best economy in years for the working class men, particularly men who didn't go to college, Harris is actually struggling with white men, perhaps not surprisingly. Polls have also detected a certain softness in Harris's support among young black men, which Trump has been trying very hard to exploit. Trump playing up his gangsta image, selling merchandise with his mugshot on it, selling gold sneakers, etc. So, really sort of crass racist stuff that Obama in particular has been really sounding the alarm on lately. Harris has been trying aggressively to counter this pitch to young men in the past few weeks with some very high-profile interviews on shows that are popular with male audiences. For example, with the radio personality Howard Stern, with a guy named Charlemagne the God, who is a sort of big figure on black radio. There's talk of her going on with a guy named Joe Rogan. Joe Rogan is the kind of guy who appeals to young men that are interested in Robert F. Kennedy Jr. and the sort of world of conspiracy theories. The Harris campaign has also been noticeably running a lot of ads on sporting events, Sunday football games, the baseball playoffs. So they're making a very high pitch for the male vote. They're not conceding that vote, in other words. Harris has gotten high praise for sitting for an interview with the Fox network, which is very, very hostile to her. And she's also been speaking much more directly about Trump's weaknesses, painting him as weak, as a coward, as soft. So she's really, I think, in very interesting and pretty smart ways, sort of trying to play into these themes of masculinity and what makes a strong man. Her pitch is very cutting, very mocking. There was certainly a lot of that in the presidential debate that you might have seen. So in light of Trump's very weird recent public appearances, there are signs that this line of attack is actually working for Harris. So it'll be interesting to see if she's able to dent his image as some kind of strong man. Just one other issue I want to raise here that's something specific to Pennsylvania and other swing states is the unprecedented amounts of money that are being spent on the campaigns. Here in Pennsylvania, we have a Senate race between an establishment figure who's very well-liked, very mild-mannered. His name is Bob Casey. He comes from a family that's been in Pennsylvania politics for decades. Casey is a very strong candidate, but he is being challenged by a guy who is a hedge fund manager who barely lives in Pennsylvania, shades of the sort of Dr. Oz, John Fetterman race of 2022. Casey has been comfortably ahead in the polls, but supposedly McCormick, his opponent, is gaining somewhat. We shall see. I don't really believe that Casey is in danger of losing his race. But there is a far more nefarious figure that has entered the race, and that's Elon Musk. The world's richest man has effectively moved to Pennsylvania, and he is pouring millions of dollars into unregulated super PACs. Thank you, Supreme Court. He has turned Twitter, now called X, into just a sort of swirling cesspool of fake AI-generated misinformation, openly fascist rhetoric, and yes, the word fascist is being widely used this year, and I think appropriately so. Harris, for her part, in terms of the money race, has been outraising Trump, and the Democrats are blanketing all forms of media with their own ads. So, again, as I said up front, it's all rather exhausting. We are just constantly being bombarded from both sides. I guess the silver lining is that future historians will have plenty of material that they can use for their own analyses. So I want to wrap this up. I've barely scratched the surface here. I haven't even mentioned Gaza or Ukraine, where I think both Netanyahu and Putin seem to be doing all they can to help Trump get reelected by their own conduct in those wars. I haven't even mentioned, the Haitian immigrants eating pets nonsense. Project 2025, so many other things. I mean, otherwise I'd be here all night. Just one final word I will say. In past presidential elections, we always looked for something called the October surprise, the sort of last-minute scandal or disaster that could change the course of the race. But crazy, outrageous things have become so normalized in the age of Trump, and American politics have become so polarized that I think Trump could light a copy of the Constitution on fire on live television, and 45% of the voters would still vote for him. So here we are. I have no idea how this is going to turn out. It's a very tense election. Whether it's really as tight as the polls say, I'm not so sure. I'm cautiously optimistic that Harris will win. So I hope that when I talk to you all live on election night, I will have some good news to report on the democracy front. So until then, tschüss.